Welcome back to chapter 11 on this book, Themis. In this chapter, what we're doing here is we're comparing three different revolutions. And the reason why we're doing this is that this is probably the best way to approach things in a scientific manner as possible when we're approaching questions about human orders. And this is something which I get from Alistair McIntyre as well with regards to his concept of epistemological crises and the comparison of different systems of thought. There are only so many ways in which you can make a comparative analysis of different systems of thought which would be rational and reasonable. Basically, the only real way to do it is to approach something which all of those systems of thought recognize as a thing or an entity or a phenomenon, and then approach that phenomenon from these different systems and to try to establish which one provides the most rich, full account of what's occurring and which ones have major gaps which do not or cannot be resolved with the resources that are currently available. Now, this approach is not perfect, it's not foolproof, because there are many ways in which proponents of different systems of thought could still maintain their position, even though it does look quite clear that their position is the weaker one. Because it could always be argued that in the future additional information will occur or new resources will be developed to reconcile any problems which are currently in existence. So in any event, again, this is not a perfect way of doing things. It's not infallible. But this is pretty much all that we really have. All we can do is to evaluate these different systems in relation to an external phenomenon which we'll recognize and then see which one provides the best analysis. And again, there are many different reasons why different proponents would not shift even though it looks very clear. So we'll get into it now. So what we're doing here is we're going to compare the Marxist analysis of revolutions, a liberal analysis of revolutions, and a Juvenalian analysis of revolutions. And from the Juvenalian perspective in particular, I listed three characteristics which were a kind of core. The first is that spontaneous order does not occur. The second is that revolutions need centralized organizations and funding for their activities. And the third thing is that revolutions are created by the actions or inactions of intermediaries of any given order. This is also an approach which was taken by other people who have approached revolutions and tried to study them in a possibly scientific manner, including Crane Britton and Theda Skocpol. And it's something which I think is pretty much the only way you can really approach this in a theoretically robust manner. So the first revolution which is approached in the book is the Russian Revolution in 1917, that period. And in each one of them, I mean, the first thing I really want to do with each one of these revolutions, I mean, first is the Russian Revolution, then it approaches the French Revolution, and then also the Iranian Revolution. In each account, when we approach them from the liberal political theory, it basically boils down to there being not much of a theory at all, because liberal political theory has to approach things from an anarchistic perspective, an ontologically anarchistic perspective, in which all of these events that occur are the result of like a spontaneous development of these individuals all acting in relation to some sort of external stimuli. It's the simplistic approach which is at the base of everything in liberalism, because it's based upon the state of nature concept of the individual, and an anthropology which has this individual who, as I've stated throughout the book, is just this like discrete individual that just comes into being magically. So one way you can save a bit of time here is by just pointing out that in each of these revolutions, the liberal account is going to be individuals suddenly became super unhappy, then they all spontaneously organized together, and then they all spontaneously overthrew their government, and then they all spontaneously organized to create a new sovereign government, and then they carried on organizing spontaneously. That is pretty much it. So on each one of them, I won't bother regurgitating the liberal position and the liberal theoretical underpinnings of the revolution, because that is it. Now, that isn't to say that liberal proponents haven't put forward good accounts of revolutions, because what always seems to happen, and this is something which I've been seeing in more recent work, including some of the reading I've been doing around the idea of elite overproduction and the work of Peter Turchin and that circle. Their work is a lot more sophisticated than that, and it's also the same with Crane Britton and, well, not so much Theda Skocpol, because she's pretty much a Marxist, but other liberal theorists who, like Crane Britton, they operate on this sort of split personality basis, and a lot of times, where on the one hand they will observe what's happening, they will make very good observations of what's happening, and they will note very complex interplays of factors, and they'll give very sophisticated accounts of what's happening. But then when it comes to the process of trying to establish the theoretical basis of what's occurring, they revert back to liberal concepts and liberal ideas. And again, this is something which I saw very clearly in Crane Britton, because his account of different revolutions, his comparative analysis of them, it's very, very good. And he notices some characteristics of the revolutions which seem to carry on across the different revolutions, and it seems to be quite systemic. But his problem is, when it comes to him trying to synthesize what's happening, he again reverts back to liberal concepts, and he has to try and reformulate this with liberal precepts. And it just results in this split personality type thing, where his basic narration and description of things and patterns which he notices is excellent, but then his theoretical construction to try and explain this is just awful. It's very, very awful, and it can't do anything. Whereas with Theda Skocpol, she's not as constrained in this sense, because she's a Marxist, and as we saw in earlier chapters, Marxists have a better conception of humans and how human thought can be constrained by the environment around them. And that doesn't mean that her account is perfect in any way, shape, or form, because she's still subject to the same problems that Crane Britton was, and she's unable to progress past her position in her works, because she was one of the proponents of I can't remember the name of it, or something like state-based theory or something, where they were trying to give the state in question the sort of characteristics of themselves, which in many ways is quasi-Juvenalian, and it does kind of work from the Marxist perspective. It's actually a very good advancement from Marxism, because if you remember, Marxism is still riddled with this liberal individual, and in Marxism they see the state as being this just arena of conflict between these classes. So it's the classes and the individuals which have still got agency in this question. But with Theda Skocpol, she was giving the state its own agency and its own imperatives, which were kind of separate, not kind of, but which were very separate from the classes which was inhabiting that state. So the state was acting as a state in accordance with the imperatives and the threats which that state was receiving, which again, it shifts the question of class influence in that case. I mean, because on one level you could say that class is still influencing this, but on another level, once you introduce that issue of the state having its own impetus, the whole system kind of falls apart, and you have to make a decision. Is it the class thing which is predominant, or has the state got its own non-class imperatives? In which case, you have to start again. You have to stop, and you have to work from a point where you have some solid ground. Now, if Theda Skocpol had done that and worked from the state's imperative specifically, she might have worked her way towards Juvenal, but she didn't do that. And subsequent theorists and subsequent people that came along and worked from her book subsequent to that, they also didn't do that. And then we were left with a situation where we had, I think it's called fourth generation revolutionary theory or fifth. I can't remember off the top of my head right now. But they, instead of looking at Theodore Skopko's work and seeing that, yes, the state's imperative and the state is having a massive influence on these revolutions and could be in many ways seen as one of the main agents of these revolutions, instead of focusing on that and working as that as the solid ground to advance from, what they did was then just reverted to this weird pluralism where they just started coming up with all this other nonsense, like just implementing feminist theory into the revolution, all of that sort of thing. So it just completely fell apart, obviously, because there's no theoretical coherence to it, because you have to start from the theoretical basis of what's occurring. You have to go back to the anthropology in question. If you haven't got a good anthropology of the human, then you can't really go anywhere. I mean, you can start from an observation which doesn't require the anthropology, which is a solid observation which you can confirm, which again was what Theodore Skopko did with giving the state its agency, but you have to then advance backwards and forwards from that to create a rounder picture. So you have to work backwards from that and say, does liberal anthropology and liberal theoretical concepts work in that system? And if not, then you need to establish what system does work with that. And if that is the case, then why is it that we're still operating with the individual theoretical system? And that's what, in many ways, that's like what I've been doing with my previous book, Nemesis, and this book, Themis, where I started from the Juvenalian observation and tried to work out in different directions what would work with that and what doesn't work with that to create a coherent and robust model which can explain matters, and instead of stopping at any particular point and doffing my hat to liberal theory. So in this chapter then, what I've done is, again, I've gone through the different political theories' approaches to these revolutions, and I've provided the Juvenalian account, Marxist account, the liberal account. So we'll kind of pretty much just focus on the Juvenalian account and the Marxist account from this point onwards, because again, each time we approach these revolutions with the liberal one, we'll just have to say, oh, it's just spontaneous, and they were all angry, and they wanted to be liberal democracies, and then they all, that type of thing. So there's no point going over that again. So beginning from the Juvenalian analysis of a Russian revolution, what we need to see is geopolitical context driving a reform which is being pushed by the order in question. So in this case, it'd be the Russian governmental system. Then we'd need revolutionary organizations which have central organizations. They actually have actual organizations which are directing matters, which are pooling resources and pooling thought, instead of just a massive random individuals spontaneously agglomerating together at different points. Then, in conjunction with that, we need to see patronage of this revolution, either from the government itself, which on first blush might sound incredibly strange, but as you'll see when we get to the French Revolution in particular, that's not that strange from the Juvenalian perspective, or from foreign actors, which is quite typical. Now, with the Bolshevik Revolution, we see all of this. One of the things that becomes quite clear with the Bolshevik Revolution is that there's a particular actor that seems to have played a large role who is not really well recognized in history, and that's a man by the name of Alexander Parvus. I believe he had many different names. One of the best ways to probably see this guy is that he's kind of like, given recent events, he's kind of like a Jeffrey Epstein-ish character. Now, throughout history, if you look closely, you see these types of characters showing up quite a lot, and there's many of them around right now. Because different orders, different organizations, different countries, what they tend to do is tend to have agents acting on their behalf in many instances, especially when it relates to quite sensitive matters such as destabilizing other orders or causing trouble or gun running or any sort of thing along those particular lines. Now, Parvus was a very central figure in the early Marxist party with Lenin and Trotsky, and he disappears for a while and goes to Istanbul, which was the capital city of the Ottoman Empire, which was quite a significant geopolitical rival to the Russians at that time, along with the German Empire. He disappears to Istanbul, and then he seems to have mysteriously become very rich in Istanbul by what looks like sort of contracts with the Ottoman army. I think what you really call this guy is a construct. Either British intelligence or Ottoman intelligence or German intelligence or a combination of them seem to have set him up in the Ottoman Empire. And then the Ottoman government seems to have been quite happy to make him wealthy. And then he ends up back with the Bolsheviks, and he ends up back with the Russians in the Germans in communication with them. And he's very clearly funding all of this stuff. He's either by himself funding it after being made rich. So this is all quite hard to prove, because one of the things is all of his documents apparently were burned and destroyed after his death, and it's quite hard to get information from Turkish sources on this because it's hidden behind language barriers, obviously. Now, my understanding of what tends to happen with these types of characters is that when you have these agents who are acting as disruptors or revolutionary agents in other countries, you obviously can't have direct bank transfers from, like, for example, in this instance, you can't have a direct bank transfer from the German government to Lenin, because then that would be obviously clear what's happening. So there has to be some sort of level of plausible deniability. So you'd have, like, the Germans or the Ottomans would make specific people like this rich, wealthy, and then they would funnel the money to these revolutionary actors like Lenin so that they could sit around in Switzerland reading books in the library until it's time for them to get activated, basically, and sent back to Russia to cause trouble, which is what exactly happened. I mean, when it comes to Lenin, it's not even particularly subtle, because he ended up getting transferred back to Russia through a train, which it seems to be pretty much common knowledge was a sealed train which was allowed express permission and transference through German territory to get to Russia. And it also seems like the communists were being funded via Sweden via some sort of illegal smuggling operation. I mean, again, this is all quite par for the course. I mean, you can see this in a lot of different situations, and it's not one of those things which I find particularly surprising at all, or think it's like unusual. This seems to be very, very normal. So we do see that very clearly in this instance. This is where the patronage for the revolution is coming from. We've got the Ottomans, we've got the Germans. There are also many indications that you've got British support of the revolution. I mean, I don't think this is directly an instance of British trying to cause the revolution or being massively in support of a revolution. I think it's more a case of keeping their finger in different pies and making sure they actually have a dog in the fight still. Even it's like hedging your bets, basically. Because when you see Trotsky and the fact that he was able to transfer from Canada all the way back to Russia, it seems pretty clear that he's got some strong connections to the British government, and it probably got some support from that field as well. Again, I don't follow along with conspiracy theorists on this, because they tend to overstate the point, and instead of just recognizing that different governments do have to operate like this, it's kind of a necessity, unfortunately. So from Juvenal's perspective, we have a lot of these principles in place already now. We've got revolutionary actors who have got patronage from different orders, and they have very clear organization. That pit is established. What we are not seeing is Lenin, Trotsky, and the rest just spontaneously coming together as random, discrete individuals who have just decided to start revolution and then have all the other revolutionaries just spontaneously come together. Instead, what you have is, again, Lenin, who's very centralized in that order, and Trotsky as well. They'll set up Marxist organizations, they'll have Marxist printing presses, they'll have funding for resources such as production of pamphlets, being able to fund people to cause trouble, to keep them fed, keep them clothed, keep them in resources, and later on would have been to keep them in weaponry, to keep them in housing, all of that type of thing. This all needs organization, it needs logistics, and it needs preparation, and that's what they did have. I don't think that's really undeniable at this point. I think there's quite a lot of evidence to prove this. So they didn't all just, again, come together spontaneously and then just spontaneously on that particular time decide that they didn't want the government anymore and take it over. That just didn't happen. Now, again, that's the liberal account. Now, if we go to the Marxist account of the revolution, we are left with complete chaos, because the Marxist account of revolutions is that, I think we've covered this already in the book, but I'll cover it very, very briefly here, is that these revolutions occur as a result of conflict between different classes, which seem to develop as a result of development of technologies, which creates new classes. So the new class, which is more productive than the old class, fights to try and take over the government, the state, and that causes the revolution. Now, in the Marxist system, there's a very clear progression of how this occurs. You have kind of like a feudal structure, and then that has a revolution leading to a bourgeoisie structure, and then that itself has a revolution which leads to the proletariat taking over. Now, in the Russian situation, they're leaping from not quite a feudal situation, but I mean kind of in the Marxist system. They're trying to leap from a feudal system to an industrial proletariat system, and even the revolutionary theoretical theories like Lenin, like Stalin, like Trotsky, understand that this doesn't make any sense, and they understand that when they're in the revolution it's occurring, it's not occurring in accordance with Marxist principles. So that's why they spend so much time coming up with all these weird excuses for why this is not the case. We don't really have to deal with that, because as we can see, if they can't explain it, then how can we explain why there's a problem there? Obviously, the best explanation is just to accept that their theoretical account of revolutions is obviously wrong, because it doesn't account for the revolution which they are in. And then we can just move on to the next one, really. And the next one we deal with is the French Revolution. Again, liberal theory, spontaneous, random, it just occurred, yeah, whatever. Marxist theory, it probably has a little bit more purchase here, because again, they're not transferring directly to an industrial proletariat revolution, and we have what the Marxists would have recognized as a bourgeoisie type country. So they had a little bit more play here in this one, but when we approach it from the Juvenalian perspective, what becomes very clear very quickly is that a lot of characters in this situation have been quite systematically neglected by liberal theorists and Marxist theorists, which has allowed them to paint a picture of this revolution which is more sympathetic to them than is actually the case. And nowhere is this more the case than in the question of who was funding the revolution and how it was organized. Because one of the major characters in the revolution was the king's cousin, Louis Philippe II, the Duke of Orleans. In France at that period of time, the richest person, the most powerful person, you could say would have been the king, and the second would have been Louis Philippe II, his cousin. He is a strange character because he seems to have been... Let's go back a second first. So with the Juvenalian perspective, first of all, we need a geopolitical context. In this situation, France at the time was in financial difficulty because it had been funding support for the American Revolution. It had been in war with the UK for quite a while, and it was pretty much groaning under its fiscal debts. And this was a large part because the government in France wasn't able to tax as efficiently and as effectively and as widely as the British could, because Britain was able to develop quite a lot more income for the state, freer taxation, despite having a much smaller population, because it was able to organize more effectively for a number of reasons. It was basically more centralized at that point than the French order was. In the French order, the nobles and the clergy still had lots and lots of privileges and were exempt from a lot of taxation, possible taxation. And then the second thing we need is possible support for revolutions that would destabilize the French order. And again, you get that in the British and even the Spanish. You get it in all the other orders around them, which is always the case. The next one, you need organization. And in this one, what's very notable about the organization of the French Revolution is the fact that it was, well, again, if we go to liberal accounts or even Marxist accounts, and if you look at any modern historical account, or just go to Wikipedia or anything like that and look at the French Revolution, the impression you get is that it was a spontaneous revolution. It was just, people were just angry and they spontaneously organized. But if you look at some of the details more closely, you realize that the central point of the revolution and where it was all organized from was the Palais Royal. Now, if you've been to France, you might know that the Palais Royal is next to the Louvre. It was the housing or the complex where Louis Philippe would have lived, and the French police and French royal police were completely unallowed to go there. And it was there that the Jacobins and all of the other revolutionary figures that were central to the revolution organized what they were doing. So we have the king's cousin supplying locations within Paris which the king and royal authority was unable to go to, where revolutionaries were organizing, preparing, and producing pamphlets and all of that type of thing, which would end up being in support of the revolution. And even the storming of the Bastille started at the Palais Royal. When the crowds went to storm the Bastille, they were carrying busts of Louis Philippe and I believe it was Necker, who was the financial minister of the Persian government. So again, every single time, all roads lead back to the Palais Royal and Louis Philippe II. That is not a spontaneous uprising of individuals. And the more you look into this character of Louis Philippe, the more clear this becomes, and the more mysterious it is that accounts of the French Revolution just skip over him very quickly or don't give him any sort of central role. For example, when there was before the French Revolution, what happened was the French king brought Parliament together, and he also convened a Parliament of Assembly of Notables, because for him to be able to tax, he had to get permission to tax, so you had to get some sort of consent. Again, that's similar to the British situation, where Parliament developed as a means by which the king could raise taxes. He had to go to Parliament, ask for taxes, they agreed to it, and so on. So what you kind of see is the French order seems to be very clearly trying to move to a British constitutional system. And part of this is happening here. So the king is actually trying to implement structural changes to the government. So he calls this Assembly of Notables to try and raise taxes. And one of the key points at which the revolution starts to get in motion is when this Assembly of Notables revolts against this. And the leader of this revolt, the first person who stood up and rejected this, was Louis Philippe II, who apparently stood up and said it's illegal, and that started the chain of events which led to the National Assembly and the revolution in France. So we have the storming of the Bastille starts at the Palais Royal of Louis Philippe. The Assembly of Notables collapses as he is the first one to say it's illegal and rejects it. And we find lots of the French revolutionaries and people involved in this process are actually being funded by Louis Philippe. And there is nothing spontaneous about that. This is not individuals coming together spontaneously. There's very clearly a patronage system in place here, and very clearly a system of organization. Now, I'm not saying that this is some sort of like plot, and this is being run by some sort of secret organization or anything like that, which you might see in conspiratorial type of approaches to this. What I'm saying is that for reasons which are not entirely clear, the king's cousin was very, very obviously the financial backer, the protector and supporter of revolutionary actors and people in the process of conflict with the French monarchy at this time. Now, one of the approaches which seems to have been common for people who do recognize the situation is to approach this as being an issue of court intrigue. So maybe what's happening here is Louis Philippe is trying to engineer himself into a position where he can overthrow his cousin and become the new king of a constitutional order. But the problem with that is, if you look at the character of Louis Philippe II, he doesn't seem like he's a very smart man. He seems like he's a very, very, very unimpressive person. I believe he was not well read at all, despite being very educated, and he seems to have been far more interested in debauchery and basically enjoying himself, which probably best to leave it at that euphemism. And it seems like maybe his system that was around him was actually the one really operating things. And when you look into it in more detail, you keep finding it's quite hard to find a lot of details about this, because I think a lot of it is in French language maybe, or wasn't translated, or it's just quite hard to find. But apparently even the famous phrase "let them eat cake," that apparently originated from his entourage, or whatever you call it. It's like a revolutionary machine they had there. And what's also suspicious about this is that the king allowed this to happen. And I think what was really happening here is, I think maybe the king's court themselves were allowing this and were utilizing this as a means to engage in juvenile conflict. Because you have to see here that the king's court, they were the ones who seem to have been pushing for constitutional and organizational changes, because they needed to raise taxation. So when we look at the revolution, and if you approach it as being a revolution which is being conducted solely by foreign actors, and that is completely against the king's wishes or the king's benefit, that's the wrong way to look at it. Because when you look at human orders, we have this upper intermediaries, lower intermediaries, and periphery. What it looks like to me is happening here is the upper intermediaries, especially in the case of the king's court, are utilizing his cousin and his wealth and his ability to organize these actors who would push for constitutional change, to do that in a means to attack the lower intermediaries of the French order, which would have been the clergy and the notables, the nobles, and all of that, who they were unable to tax because they couldn't change, and they weren't able to change the system off because of them. So the king's court actually had every incentive in that sense to support Louis Philippe. So I keep calling him Louis Egalitaire because he actually changed his name to Philippe Egalitaire after the revolution, which, again, it's just one of those pieces of information, along with his vast funding of the revolutionaries, which is just, I find completely astonishingly, it's just astonishing that it's just written out of French revolutionary history, basically. So what I think here, again, is I think the French court is trying to change the governmental system in France. It can't do it directly because it doesn't have the power and the capability to do that. So it's supporting revolutionary activity to try and attack it from the ground up. So it's a pincer movement, basically. Or in other terms, we call it high-low versus the middle. But I think what happened with this process is it spun out of control, and the lower intermediaries who it was targeted at ended up taking over this process and running with it, and it just spun out of control. So that's where we'd also separate from conspiratorial accounts of this type of thing, because with conspiracy theories about revolutions and stuff like that, they tend to see everything as being perfectly aligned and perfectly executed. So like if they say that, say, in the Illuminati or something like that, Freemasons, who did have influence on this, because again, Louis Philippe II was, I think, the head of the Freemasons in France at that time as well. Again, you could problem with conspiratorial theories, they do this. They say, oh, the conspirators wanted to do this, they did this, they did this, they did this, and they succeeded. When really what happens is you have conspirators who want to do something, they do something, it starts to spin out of control, somebody else takes over the operation or the process, they maybe succeed or it carries on spinning out of control, and you have another set of people who take over the process. And that's what I think happened with the French Revolution. You have probably the Freemasons are involved in this, and you have Louis Philippe, and you probably have the king who was supporting it, at least tacitly, because I don't believe that he would have allowed his cousin to operate instead of just kicking him out of the country or just sending in his police into that place anyway, or just operating some other sort of system to actually put it down, unless he tacitly supported what was happening, which I think he did. So it looks to me like the French Revolution was a state-directed process, which again spun out of control. And that covers and shows up far, far more detail than the Marxist analysis of revolutions and obviously the liberal analysis of revolutions. We've managed to, using the Juvenalian theory, identify Louis Philippe, identify his resources, his patronage. We've identified many other different actors in that process, and we've managed to create a chain of events and a chain of connections which gives some sort of explanatory power to this account. Whereas, again, with the liberal account, oh, it spontaneously happened, whatever, and the Marxist account, oh, they were changing to a new bourgeoisie system because of economic conflicts and along those lines, which, again, none of them can actually explain why it happened at that time. But from our Juvenalist perspective, we can explain why it happened at that time. The French court needed to raise funds, it needed to reorganize the country to do so, it was indebted, it had serious problems, and it supported these revolutionary actors indirectly as a means to attack its other enemies, which would have been the notables and the clergy, which were impeding on their actions. So it's far, far more richer in its explanatory powers. One of the problems we have with this, though, is that one of the advantages which is supplied to liberal accounts and Marxist accounts to a small degree in this sense is that a lot of this information, including this, it gets hidden and it gets destroyed, especially after the revolution occurs. One of the things which I found out was that apparently Napoleon had some sort of report issued as to the causes of the French Revolution and the involvement of government financing of revolutionaries. And upon reading the report, I believe he burned it, which is entirely unsurprising because I believe if that was still available, it would have very clearly pointed out that the king was probably supporting, financing a lot of the revolutionary activities which were occurring. And it was quite, to a large degree, an internally created phenomenon. It probably had lots of influence from the UK as well. I believe Louis Philippe had spies in his entourage, and he was very much an Anglophile. He spent a lot of time in England, I believe. He also, I think, strangely enough, purchased an English girl to raise with his daughter or something like that. I think maybe it's him or maybe it was his previous cousin, previous ancestor. I can't quite remember at this time. But yeah, this sort of information tends to get burned, especially if these revolutionaries are the ones that end up winning the process and being in power, because obviously they don't want this sort of information to get out. Instead, they've got every incentive to create it, to present it as being a revolutionary, spontaneous development. So a lot of the time, when it comes to very fresh revolutions at the very least, this sort of information is very hard to get. And it usually takes maybe a decade, can maybe take up to a century sometimes for the information to come out cleanly. I mean, for example, like in the French Revolution, there's actually a series of memoirs by Louis Philippe's son, which he wrote, and then he had locked up for about, I think, 100 years or 150 years. That was the assertion, and then he got released, and he revealed stuff like there was English spies in his father's entourage, and other information of that type of character. So again, it's one of those things where in the immediate situation, the actual reality of what's happening, the actual information, either is hidden, it gets destroyed, or subsequently after the story of it being a spontaneous situation comes in, and that becomes the political necessity of explaining it, that ends up warping every subsequent reading of that situation. And that's something we find in, for example, the Iranian Revolution as well, which is the next one we covered. Because, again, with the Iranian Revolution in 1978, we see all of these same issues. First of all, geopolitical conflict, geopolitical problems. In Iran at that time, there was not so much an issue of the Iranian order needing to develop taxation because they were one of the major oil-producing countries. They had lots of funds. Their big problem was that they were involved in energy politics and also the politics of the Cold War and the influence of different actors. So they were kind of stuck between the Soviet Union and the Americans. There's also influence from the French and the British, and then you had Iraq, obviously, and then you've got Saudi Arabia. I think a lot of this also ties in with the supplies of oil and political situation in the USA. Because what you have in the USA, obviously, is you have the Republican Party and you have the Democrat Party. And the Shah in Iran, it was very much entwined with a very specific cast of characters. The Iranian order then was very tied in with South Africa, Israel especially, and also the Republican Party, who the Shah was funding to a degree. And in opposition to that, you have the Democrat Party, and they were not particularly happy with this situation because, I mean, it's complicated, but if you look at it this way, if you have Iran, which is the major oil producer, and it can kind of control the price of oil, which directly relates to the inflation situation in the USA, which just do not listen to economists. Inflation is very, very, very tied to energy prices. Everybody knows this. The economists are complete frauds on this. If Iran is going to manipulate its oil prices, for example, so that it's low when the Republicans are in position, but then high when the Democrats are in position, that's a bit of an issue for Democrats, obviously. And it's also an issue for them if the Shah is supporting the Republicans financially in many other ways. So what you have is this situation where you have like Republicans which kind of allied with the Shah, and then on the other side you have the Democrats who end up being obviously allied with the Saudis. So that's why you have this big shift in American relations where the Saudis become like the dominant partner when it comes to energy supplies following the revolution in Iran. So in this situation, what you have is the Democrat presidential system is very incentivized to support revolutions in Iran to get rid of the Shah and put their own people in place. And that's exactly what you see happens in Iran. And Carter's a very big part of that. Apparently, other intelligence assets in different countries, such as France and America as well, warned the Shah that the Carter administration had set up a process to overthrow him and get rid of him. And he was warned of this apparently through the Safari Club, through the French part of that at the very least. And so you can see how American domestic politics ends up getting very entangled with energy politics in the Middle East and other places is something which is still the case now. It's also the same thing in the UK as well. This is all entangled. It makes it very, very complex. But in this case, the salient point is this. The people in Iran did not spontaneously organize to have a revolution at that point. They also didn't engage in a Marxist revolution to create a Marxist proletariat government because, as you can see, it ended up being what was called a very religious revolution. So on both of those counts, it doesn't really make any sense, and everybody in revolutionary theory has already recognized this quite clearly at this point. But from a Juvenalian perspective, we can start to notice some very interesting points. Firstly, the Shah had actually been engaged in quite a lot of alteration of the order in Iran and centralization as well. Apparently, one of the big assistants in this was actually he brought in advisors who were ex-Leninists and also advisors who were connected to Samuel Huntington, because he was trying to create a sort of a one-party system in Iran. And the problem with the Shah was that he doesn't seem to have been a very impressive man again. He seems to have been very corrupt and very debauched, and it's not a very impressive person. And the changes that he brought into place were not done very well, and they didn't work very well at all. So this added to to some degree, there is some sort of, I don't want to give too much credit to liberal theory, but you do have to have a sense of discontent in that order, but it's not in the liberal sense. So a lot of time this discontent is actually caused by the order in question, who are usually creating changes which cause some problems, but in the future might be beneficial, but they're doing it very poorly, and they're not organizing it very well, and they don't have enough safety measures in place to ensure that if things start to go a little bit off, then they can enforce order and ensure that things stay stable. That's a good example here with the Iranian regime. They couldn't do that. And when you have the Americans coming and supporting the process of revolution and the overthrow of the Shah, I think it's very obvious where the patronage here comes from. You could say a lot of the patronage for the revolution is coming from places like Iraq and the USSR, and there's definitely going to be cases where patronage from those regions is coming in. But I think the definitive one was definitely the Americans, probably the French as well, because Khomeini was sitting out in France at that time. But the Americans were definitive, and it leads you to this question where Marxist theory and liberal theory are absolutely unable to answer this question at all. Well, liberalism completely. Marxism to a little bit of a degree, but liberalism just cannot. And that's the question of why the revolutions occur at the times they occur. Now, with liberalism, again, it's just everybody got angry. Okay. With Marxist theory, it's that certain developments occurred which brought new economic systems into play, and then you have new classes and so on, and it's entirely fuzzy. With the Juvenalian theory, it gives very precise definitions and explanations why it occurred at that time, and you can see that very clearly with the Iranian one. Apparently, one of the main institutions at question here was the FMI or LMI, Freedom Movement Iran or something like that. Apparently, immediately prior to the revolution, members of the Carter administration directly informed, and the intelligence agency directly informed the FMI and other actors around them that the Carter administration had told the Shah that he had to liberalize or be removed. And then I'm not sure what more you need in that instance. When you've got the American government funding these organizations, and they literally told these organizations he needs to liberalize or we're going to remove him, and then you subsequently have a revolution which is led by these different organizations. I don't understand what more you actually need in that instance. There's a very clear chain of events and a very clear cause and effect there. The Americans say we're going to get rid of him if he doesn't liberalize. They obviously fund these revolutionary actors to do that. They obviously get it in place. They obviously give the go-ahead. It happens. It's very, very clear what happened there. There's no, everybody spontaneously got angry and then it happened. Or there's no, at a certain stage of production, people developed into a different class. It's very direct and it's very clear. I mean, one of the arguments you could bring against this is that, the revolution didn't work out like that. They ended up with an order in place which is very hostile to the Americans. So why would they do that? Again, this is the difference between conspiratorial theory and theory which is within the Juvenalian model. We're not saying that somebody organized for something to happen and then they put it in place and it happened exactly as they wanted it to happen. Instead, what happened again, as with the French Revolution, these things can get started by one agency or one organization for a specific end, but then once it happens, it spins out of their control and it can be taken over by different actors in different organizations, different agencies, and go in different directions. So it's not really much of a criticism of this. I mean, I believe the general consensus at that time was that he would let his second in command run affairs. I think his name was Ayatollah Mohammed Beheshti or something like that. But that didn't work. Instead, Khomeini stayed in power, and affairs operated in such a way that they ended up being very anti-American. It basically ran out of their control. But that doesn't discount the fact that they were the ones who actually instigated and pressured it and actually got it going in the first place. Sure, the Iranian Revolution regime was at fault for creating conditions whereby people would be upset and be willing to go in that direction. And I mean, I don't think in this instance that they had much of an interest in actually pushing that forward and being a part of encouraging revolution in the same way like in the French Revolution. But that's just an issue of different patronage and different circumstances and different revolutions. There's no one size fits all of them. But this model of there being a patron of either that order or of a different order still holds, as does the organizational principles involved there, as does the funding, and the fact that this is not spontaneous and it's happening in relation to, well, let's say, instead of saying geopolitical events, the international situation in which it's existing. Because when we say geopolitical, people can tend to see that as country versus country or being a very state-centered thing, whereas, as you can see with this Iranian situation, it's far more complicated than that. You have the Republican Party, you have the Democrat Party, you have different factions, and you have the energy politics involved in this. And if we go back to the liberal theory, and again the Marxist theory, how are they explaining the involvement of American funding and the American Carter administration telling these actors, look, he has to liberalize or we're going to get rid of him? How does that fit in any of those political theories? I mean, that's one of the key things which I think is not noticed much about liberal theory of revolutions and Marxist theories of revolutions, is that they're very, very internally focused. They don't count for any external factors at all. Again, the liberal one, people get angry, they have a revolution, they overthrow the government. It doesn't account for any involvement by foreign actors at all. When, if you look at the news or follow any events at all, you know that's completely nonsensical. And that's the same with the Marxist theory as well. The Marxist theory approaches it as being, again, different classes, they end up in conflict, one class takes over the state. Well, what about the influence of other actors outside of that order? It just ignores that. It makes it very centrally focused, and it's completely... The only way I can describe it is ontologically anarchistic. It tries to force this idea that you have to start up from the individual building block of the individual, which again brings us right back to the state of nature issue. So you have to, if you're trying to develop any theory as to what's happening, you have to start from this individual and build up from this individual, piece by piece, from that point onwards. Whereas that just does not correspond to reality at all. So you have this situation where if somebody's just basically giving a narrative of events, a story-like narrative of events, of revolutions, they give a far more scientific, full and clear account of revolutions than a liberal theorist could ever supply by going through liberal theory. And again, this is what, I've said this before, but this is what you get in people like Crane Britton. And I also think you get this in the newer people thinking about revolutions. Again, Turchin and his circle. I'm not trying to disparage their positions or their approaches to this. I recently read one of the papers by, I believe his name is Hoyer. Let me double check that here. It was Daniel Hoyer and Peter Turchin et al. And they cover a number of different crises where they were looking at how these different orders managed to avoid revolutions in their particular time periods. And it covers, I think it's the Qing Empire, and it covers the British, Britain during the Chartist phase. And it does the same thing as Britain, in that when it's not focusing on liberal theory and when it's actually working from observations and noticing complex patterns and recounting those complex patterns and looking at the interactions of these different things, is very, very interesting, but it then gets really tied up in knots because there's always this desire or need or just process of reverting back to liberal assumptions and these ontological anarchistic assumptions. Like, for example, in the paper, it's talking about elite overproduction. It's talking about the creation of dissatisfaction and anger due to a mismatch between that generation's expectations of what they should be able to achieve and get, as opposed to the situation as it actually exists, creating senses of society's institutions malfunctioning is the word it uses. But then you have to think about this then. The change, also a part of this is covering is like population improvement and improvement in living conditions, things along those lines. But you have to ask the question then, are these changes that are occurring, are they occurring spontaneously and without the implementation or input of the orders in question? Or are these changes occurring as a result of the actions of the orders in question, in which case you cannot build it up from a ground-up basis? So you can't just look specifically at population, because the population itself is a function of the actions of the order in question. And a good example of this is like when you see population increases occurring in China after the introduction of New World crops. If you're going to work from the population increase as the initial point of reference and work from there, you've skipped a question, because you have to ask the question, well, why was that population increasing, and why did they suddenly introduce New World crops? Now, in modern understanding, they probably think of it as something along the lines of, farmers realized that these New World crops were more productive and they made more sense, so they started introducing them, which again is kind of a liberal interpretation of events there. But if you look more closely at a lot of these factors, like agricultural issues like that, you'll find in many orders, agricultural development, agricultural growth, and which crops are being used and which crops are being developed is actually, I don't want to say state directed or state organized, because in many places you can't really say they have states, but it's very much intermediated by orders. So, for example, New World crop production, I believe the Qing administration was behind the introduction of a lot of that. So if they're the ones introducing that on purpose to increase yields, to increase population, increase tax income, then if you're starting from the population increases and acting as if that's a scientific basis you can start from that's completely neutral, then you've made a mistake immediately, because it isn't. It's actually a policy decision by people in that order. And you also see that with questions of territorial expansion. If the population increasing due to territorial expansion, again, that's a policy decision which is being developed by that order. Again, I don't want to say state, because in a lot of places, again, you can't say it's a state, but it's going to be someone in that order is making the decision to do that, which has caused the population increase, which is then it caused subsequent issues, which then cause situations of unhappiness, and which those states might not be able to manage properly. Another example of this would be Britain as well, and the population growth in the 18th century leading up to the Industrial Revolution. The question is, again, do you treat this population growth as just being like a spontaneous thing which is just happening by itself, or is that something which was something you could say is as a result of the actions of governance itself? Because one of the reasons for the population increase at that time and period, I believe, is not so much that people were just having more children, is that the mortality rate of children was decreasing rapidly, which was a function of governmental actions which created increased hygiene. So it would have been, for example, the increased ability to create sewer systems, or increasing hygiene due to engineering advancements, which again is policy decision, is decision by the government. So this population increase is directly a result of the governmental or the order's actions in question at that time. So this is not a spontaneous thing that's happening. This is something which is far more complex than that. And when you look at things like cryodynamics and things like that, they tend to want to try to... I don't think they want to do that, but I think it's just something which they do naturally, because that's just how it naturally occurs with political theory in general. And this is also the case with things which modern people would throw into the term economy, which to be fair, to be honest, I don't believe there is an economy. I don't think the concept of economy makes much sense at all. It's one of those things we should introduce in the early 20th century as a means to kind of make the orders in question more legible to state actors. But it was pretty much a construct at that time. Nobody was talking about economies before that time. Nobody was acting as if economies existed. And the same with monetary systems as well. These are things which don't operate automatically or spontaneously by themselves. The shape that they have, the directions they take, and how they pan out is it's always a policy decision. So when we talk about wages and we talk about the worth of currency, for example, they're usually, again, I don't know why I'm saying usually, they're always a function of the policies of the orders in question going in that direction. So, for example, if you have inflation due to currency debasement, that's because the order is doing that because of the necessity of, for example, raising resources. And the same would be the opposite. And it's also got to be entwined with the general trading outlook of those particular orders and their general position within those orders. So you can't take any of these as being like the ground basis, which is completely separate from the order in question, to start from a ground up process. So again, like population increase, you can't take that as a neutral, just like a natural thing, and then act as if that's something you can start the basis of a science from, when it's very clear that the population levels are being influenced, at the very least, by the orders in question and their policies. Now, I understand with the concept of elite overproduction, it's a lot more sophisticated than this, but I also think that, again, it just keeps slipping back into these liberal assumptions and liberal modes of thinking, which, again, is something which Prime Britain did, and which all liberal theorists of any interest do. I mean, even Theodore Scott does it at quite a few points. If you look at the concept of an elite as well, for example, I mean, what are we even talking about when we talk about an elite that's part of the elite overproduction? And why do we have these elites? Obviously, these elites are being created by order, because to be an elite, you have to be recognized as an elite. But then we have different types of elites. I mean, and also, this is something I think theorists in elite overproduction, I think they sort of recognize this as well. There's a big problem with defining elites and what's going on here. And I think a big problem that they have with that is that they haven't approached the anthropological issue properly, and they haven't resolved that in any way, shape, or form. And they haven't resolved the structure of governance and structure of orders in any way at all. So you end up with a situation where they're talking about elites in the state structure and then elites outside of the state structure. And then you have financial elites, religion. Well, it's just not getting to the details here. Like, why are they elite? I mean, who's making them elite? On what basis? Are they assuming they're elite just because everybody assumes that they're elite? Or are they elite because the government or the order in question has granted them that status? If the government in question has granted them that status, then we have to focus on the government or the order in question and its role in that particular order. In which case, again, we're back to focusing on the order in question in much the same way as we were with the increase or decreases in population. We can't treat the elite as being the start point of what's happening here, and just as we can't treat the population as being the start point. It's too complicated, too complex, and too intertwined. We have to, I mean, if anything, you'd have to start with the order or the state in question. Again, this is not hostile criticism. I think on a lot of points they're very, very astute. They're very, very clear and actually onto something in many instances. But I think it's the general tendency to try and fall back on liberal conceptions, liberal understandings, and liberal precepts, and the approach of science which you find in something like Hobbes. There are actually quite positive indications along that line, these lines in this Poyer paper. For example, when he talks about the American situation in the early 20th century, it does look at these supposed elites more closely and focus on the fact that you have some of these elites who seem to be very focused or very aligned with the state structure and actually give up some of their advantages and positions within the system towards the state structure and don't fight against it, which ends up being ultimately in their benefit because, I mean, the order doesn't collapse into revolution or cause problems. And you have other I mean, you'd also have, and I mean, it also differentiates state and non-state elites, which in a sense is kind of like, it kind of works along the line of Juvenalian model in that sense that we have upper intermediaries and lower intermediaries. I don't call them elites because of this. There's so much conceptual issue with the concept of an elite. Whereas if you look at them as intermediaries in the governmental structure, it makes a lot more sense. Because if you talk about the state elites as being upper intermediaries and those aligned with the state elites being upper intermediaries, and you have the other elites who are lower intermediaries who are going to be very unhappy in situations when their prerogatives and their authorities are being taken away or reduced due to the policies of these upper intermediaries, then you have this conflict between these two sets of intermediaries. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that, but I mean, even then, it explains things a lot better than elite overproduction, which just conflates all of these factors together and contains within it some assumptions which I'm still not sure what the assumptions are because they're not really laid out very well. I don't think elite overproduction theorists themselves understand what the assumptions are in elite overproduction because I don't think they've clarified much of it really, which is a shame because I think they've got a massive amount of potential to develop something out of this, but I don't know. I have to do some more reading on that before I can give more criticisms or more feedback on that issue. But as for this video, I think that will pretty much be the end of it today then.